In the mining sense specifically, energy has decided the fate of nations and civilizations throughout history. And this is gunpowder for the energy world. This is a puzzle piece and a technology and a step change innovation that I think completely changes the game in what is the underpinning resource of our civilization.
Hey everyone, quick thing before we start. Over 50,000 of you keep coming back to watch and listen to this podcast, but over 65% of you still haven't subscribed yet. So here's my simple ask. If you find value in my Bitcoin content and you enjoy what I'm doing, please take a second to hit subscribe on YouTube or follow me on your go-to podcasting app. It's a small action that really helps push my content through the algorithm, and this way we can make sure that more people learn about Bitcoin. Thanks for being part of this journey. Now let's dive into this episode. All right, Beau Turner, welcome to Bitcoin for Millennials.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, man, I think it's really fun that you're on. I haven't really had lots of conversations about mining, so I'm excited to talk about that. And yeah, I was thinking maybe to start, I just want to ask you, what is the biggest opportunity you see with regards to Bitcoin mining?
I think the biggest opportunity in the very long time frame is to remake the way that we interact with energy and create an abundant energy future that makes all of civilization more prosperous. And since we're recording this in December of 24, the very immediate opportunity is you can buy some miners and depreciate them and write them off on your taxes and maybe save some money from going to the government. So 2 answers for you.
I think the first one intrigues me. I mean, I don't want to go the whole soft war path immediately, but what do you mean by what you said? Like, how are we reshaping that with Bitcoin mining?
So Bitcoin mining to me is a perfect system of energy incentives that doesn't pirate or pillage energy, but wants to use it all the time. And just by the nature of being constantly hungry for it, but also able to flexibly not use it, it's this perfect puzzle piece that completes our step change in how we interact with energy. And one of the biggest issues that we've seen in the energy landscape is not that we don't have enough energy, it's that we don't have the most efficient use of the energy that we have available. A stat that I like to talk about is that California alone curtails more energy in a year than the bottom 30 energy poor countries in the world. So it's not that we don't have enough energy in the world, it's that we aren't using it effectively. And to me, mining is the coolest tool that we have to make sure that we use energy more effectively.
Yeah, I love that. That's a great stat. I think to dial in on that, because I did have different conversations around energy where we kind of touched upon mining, but since you're a real mining expert, I think we can go a bit deeper. I remember, I think it was DASB who told me that like the efficiency of most renewable energy sources, or like the ROI of just the hardware, is like 30%. But of course, there's 100% investment. So basically, we are paying 3 times as much for the energy as what it's supposed to be, right? And I mean, I've also talked with Daniel Batten, and I said, why doesn't anyone understand that if you, let's say, spend $1 million, well, it's probably more, but $1 million for the sake of the calculation, right, on a windmill, you spend that's gone. You have to recoup that investment, right? So you want the highest ROI possible, or at least you want the thing to turn whenever the wind is blowing. Right. But I think a lot of people know the images of windmills standing still even when the wind is blowing. Right. And that's mainly because the energy that's created cannot be sent anywhere. Like either it cannot be added to the net, or there's no demand. That basically makes us pay more for the energy that they eventually do create and that we also actually use. Right. But I mean, it makes so much sense to add Bitcoin miners to a windmill park just to have them turn always when the wind turns. I mean, and he looked at me and he was like, "Yeah, that's right." And I was like, "What? Why isn't this happening?" Is that something that you can elaborate on, or like what is your view Or what are your thoughts on
Yeah,
that?
one of my favorite, well, maybe it's not my favorite moment, but one of the most like peak clown world moments that I ever had when I was doing research on mining was on wind farms specifically. They have these things called load banks, and they're essentially just this expensive piece of equipment that you'll put next to a windmill that is this like battery that goes to nowhere because you can't necessarily stop the turbine. You can't necessarily sell the energy. So you have to just have this like dump thing.
It's like a buffer thing.
And it's
Yeah.
literally waste by design. Like you're paying money to be able to dump energy uselessly into something. So you can replace that with a fleet of Bitcoin miners, and you've actually got a use for that energy now. But you mentioned it, and it's just a really funny system of incentives where let's say that we are renewable energy developers. We're incentivized to go out and develop as much as we can and constantly sell it into the grid, even if we're selling it at negative pricing, because so much of the income that we get comes from subsidies that require us to sell that energy, even if we're selling it, again, at negative pricing. And the downside of that is that you're selling a commodity and having it subsidized by the taxpayer that nobody needs at any given time, and just creates all this waste that people have to bear, but that enriches people that develop energy projects. Well, I'm a big fan of integrating Bitcoin mining with these projects, because now you have a real natural consumer that can pay you market rate for this energy, help you break even, and then the taxpayer doesn't have to bear the brunt of everybody who wants to go and develop new energy sources.
Yeah, it feels like you can add like 2 or 3 extra dimensions to prop up the ROI, which I think can go to over 100%. If you also keep some Bitcoin as like the proprietary owner of the wind farm, right? If you keep a cut of that, like it just makes so much sense that when you buy equipment, you just want to use it whenever you would be able to use it, and therefore, make some revenue. I just Googled, because I saw last week something about the UK paying to waste power, and I found it. This is a Bloomberg headline, which it's from December 2. UK is paying £1 billion to waste a record amount of wind power. Britain faces mounting costs from overwhelmed electricity grid. Constraints on the network could jeopardize decarbonization plans, right? So I think there's multiple things. There is just a general problem of the fact that you cannot store energy. I once heard a stat. I'm not sure if it's fully correct, but I heard it later again. Like if you put all the batteries in Europe together, you can store like all the energy for 10 seconds or something like that. Like there's no way to store energy over time. So you have to use it. So that's one. So like not all the energy is used. Plus the grids are not ready to even transport that energy to maybe a distance further away from where it's sourced with wind, for example. So yeah, it just makes so much sense for me that to add the Bitcoin miners, like that's probably the lowest cost and quickest way, most mobile way to at least make sure that you don't pay £1 billion a month.
It's just
a
low
year.
hanging fruit.
Yeah.
I mean, at some point we expect batteries to get better, to get less expensive. It's not that these technologies aren't helpful and that they don't exist. It's just that in the case of batteries specifically, you mentioned it, you have to put on a ton of capacity in order to be able to store any kind of appreciable amount of energy that would keep civilization running. And it's super expensive. I mean, it's just way cost prohibitive to be able to put on that much capacity in a short period of time. And Bitcoin miners are a natural user of that same energy. And you can build facilities for, depending on your metric, 2 to 10% of the cost per megawatt of some of these energy storage vehicles. And I like to be, as academically honest as I can be and have integrity when we talk about this, because it's not that these solutions don't exist and that they're not good. It's just that this is the cheapest thing that we can use in the meantime to kind of bootstrap our way to maybe a long-term solution where we can store this energy. And Bitcoin isn't exactly a battery in the true physical sense, but it is a battery in the economic sense that allows us to store that wealth per se and redeploy it somewhere else.
So what do you think, or what is what's like the biggest misunderstanding about Bitcoin mining that you would want to address?
I'm really grateful for people like Daniel Batten that do a way better job of this and a way more consistent job. And same with Satoshi Action Fund and Satoshi Action Education. But the whole idea that Bitcoin mining is bad for the environment is just the most heinous lie that I spend most of my time debunking for people that aren't familiar with the industry. And in reality, it's one of our greatest tools for saving the environment, cleaning up the environment, using our resources more effectively. I mean, if you've seen things like, Crusoe or any of these natural gas miners that are taking flares, and instead of letting those flare out into the atmosphere, vent into the atmosphere, they're mining Bitcoin with it. Those kinds of projects, I think, just completely invalidate everything that has been said about Bitcoin mining, where you're literally removing waste from the atmosphere. We're working on projects in Oregon as well, where we partner with local landfills that are venting methane into the air. And those projects, while they're expensive, they're extremely beneficial for, the atmosphere and just reducing pollution. I'm sure if you've talked to Daniel, he would tell you, methane is 25 to 85 times more pollutant than CO2. So anything that you can do to mitigate methane is a huge benefit to the cleanliness of our atmosphere. And that's one of the coolest things that I think people don't understand about mining and don't understand about Bitcoin, is that it's one of the first non-subsidized ways that we can profitably clean up our environment.
Bitcoin custody is evolving, and while self-custody is important, it has its own risks and trade-offs. OnRamp is pioneering a new standard, multi-institution custody, which eliminates single points of failure, adding fault tolerance and redundancy to your custody setup. OnRamp secures your Bitcoin in a segregated cold storage multi-signature vault, guarded by 3 independent institutional-grade custodians, none of which have unilateral control. Your funds are fully auditable on-chain, cannot be rehypothecated, and can only move or withdrawn at your explicit direction. Multi-institution custody removes the technical, mental, and physical burdens of private key management, providing unparalleled peace of mind for you and your loved ones. Bitcoin is money, and as the price continues to appreciate, OnRamp helps you seamlessly tap into financial services like trading, inheritance, insurance, loans, IRAs, and more, all without compromising on security or accessibility. Check out onrampbitcoin.com through the link below and schedule a consultation with the OnRamp team to get to know them and learn more about their offering.
Yeah, it's actually a way to attract for-profit companies, right, that have to innovate in order to be competitive, right, as opposed to, well, when you get grants or subsidies or whatever, I think there's a less of an incentive to actually do that. And I love that you mentioned methane, right, because reducing the methane emission, I think, is one of the top 3 UN sustainability goals, right? I think there's different approaches to doing that, from making like huge fans, I think in Norway, where they suck up air and then do something and then they put air out again. And I remember, Daniel telling me that if you turn off the flaring, right, because even with the flaring, there's still like a certain percentage of pure methane that just gets in the air, right? Like it's only like it's 80% reduction of the original, something like that. I'm butchering the numbers, but not that much, right? But just doing methane landfills and using that to mine Bitcoin is, again, it's just such low-hanging fruit. Like what do you run into? Is this we talk about it like it's an easy pitch, but I can imagine it's not in real life. Like how do you approach that? Or like what do you come across?
It's such an educational barrier to overcome with people. I mean, if you think about how much most people understand about money, how much most people understand about energy, it's very little. So trying to show them this shiny, beautiful system over here that helps us fix all of these problems that in many cases they're not even aware of is the biggest thing. And it's not necessarily that people don't understand it or won't understand it or actively fight you, so much as it just takes a while to build the mental model for them to understand what is really going on and what is the solution to it. I mean, it takes, if you're anything like me, Bram, you've spent hundreds, if not thousands of hours at this point studying the network, the impacts of the network, the ways that it runs through different aspects of our lives. And the difference between you an hour in and you 1,000 hours in is just profound. And many of us lose sight of what it's like to go through that journey the first time and be exposed to essentially have the mirror held up to how things really work. And just getting people to recognize that when there's no real incentive for them to is the biggest challenge, in my opinion.
Yeah, it's a good point. I also think that because that is so hard, kind of like counter arguments that people have that they, I think a lot of the times repeat from the TV, right? So like, no, it should be used for another type of like this energy should be used for something else, right? But as you pointed out in the beginning, the entire incentive, the goal of a Bitcoin miner is to find the cheapest energy possible, right? So not the regular energy. It's always at the end of a certain chain, the energy that's wasted or just thrown away. So that's like the main thing that you hear a lot. And I think that comes from this kind of like in-between phase where you're like, okay, I'm talking about this subject, but I don't know enough, but I heard this thing about it, right? So there I go with my kind of like counter argument. I think that in general is the same for, just as with understanding Bitcoin. It's just such a big topic, and I think one of the questions I wanted to ask is like, how can we educate people? And you alluded to it before, like Bitcoin mining is probably has like the only purpose-built computers that can be turned on and turned off in the quickest way possible to actually help the distribution of the energy that is created, right? Sometimes people say, well, no, AI is going to be a thing. It should power AI clusters and stuff like that. But yeah, if I'm on ChatGPT and the cluster that I'm on turns off, then I cannot use the thing, right? Like I cannot use the product or the service. So there's not really an alternative for any other type of, well, let's call it a data center, right? To just turn on and off in, I don't know, how quick can you do that with a Bitcoin
Less
miner?
than 60 seconds.
Exactly, right? So I don't know if there's anything else that could even compete with that. But yeah, I'm thinking about where I want to go with my question, but I see that like there's just a gap, like you start a conversation, but where you are is so much further. So you have to like drill down to what are like the closest benefits for whoever you're talking with.
You hit it. Talk about benefits, not features, when you're talking about a product. That's like marketing 101 is talk about why it's applicable to the person that you're talking to and why it solves a pain point. So this as well as I do now. We're starting to get more and more serious about our media and education. And that requires you to do something, or it requires me particularly to do something which I'm not used to doing, which is really lowering the kind of engineering speak down to a 5th grade reading level as much as I can. And not because, you're trying to pander to somebody, but just because there's so much to unpack. You have to get people to a way that they can actually understand what you're saying and for it to be accessible to them. Many, many times I see, specifically in the mining industry, you go to a mining conference and it's like, it's my people, right? It is the nerdiest of the nerds who understand all of this stuff and absolutely love talking about it and talking about the nuances. But most people walking around don't get joy out of that and their brains just turn off. I think about people like my wife, who's a brilliant woman, but I start talking about demand response and curtailment and energy abundance, and she is just asleep faster than anything you would imagine. And that's most people. So we have this challenge of educating people, not just about Bitcoin, which is already a kind of hard to understand niche for most people approaching it for the first time, but go one level deeper into the niche sphere of Bitcoin mining, which is everything that they already didn't understand about Bitcoin, actualized into physical reality and interacting with all these other huge global systems that they don't understand necessarily, like energy. So it's a journey. It's a skill for us to build, for all of us to build if we're in the space and we're, public facing and speaking to people. As much as you can simplify things and really connect it to how it impacts each individual, like making your electric bill cheaper or cleaning up your environment. I think those approaches are far more effective than talking to people about why this is the soundest money in the world.
Yeah, it feels like everything, Bitcoin is kind of like the sly roundabout way to escape from the fiat currency, right? But in order to have something like mining permeate more, like certain types of services, like it's the same kind of approach, the sly roundabout way, right? Like kind of like, do you want to up the ROI of your wind farm? Yeah, of course I want to do that, and then of course then later you talk about the mining part, but yeah, it feels like an interesting journey, and like the being such a geek and being totally into a subject and then trying to see if you can, find the market for it. I think is a very fascinating challenge that you've given yourself. Yeah, but before this, you were in real estate. I understood, the full-time real estate. How did you go to Bitcoin mining? Like how did you make that switch?
At the time, I was a full-time real estate investor, managing rental properties, mortgage notes, basically a property portfolio across the Southeast. And the events of 2020 just forced me to re-examine so many different things about how our world works. And a few well-placed podcasts from our friend Michael Saylor came into my world at the right time, forced me to look at how our systems work and what value really is derived by in our modern world, built on a foundation that I no longer thought held true. So while it was the perfect vehicle of the last 50 years or even 500 years, depending on your time frame, I wasn't so sure that it was going to be the right vehicle for the next 50 years. And so I moved up to Oregon at that time as well. So I had kind of a gap where lifestyle was changing, had a lot of time for reading, discovered Price of Tomorrow, Sovereign Individual, all of these books that are foundational for a lot of people in the space. And I knew that it was time to start unwinding the real estate portfolio. But the biggest gap for me was, how can I sell a cash flowing asset for an asset that doesn't produce any cash flow at all? And we all saw what happened with Celsius and BlockFi and, all of these places where people were trying to get yield on their Bitcoin and get an income stream from it that blew up. That didn't work out too well. So the thought was, how do I actually make an income in this space? And so I felt, okay, I can do this, let's give it a shot. So started small, tried out with just a few small facilities, but really went big with a co-location host. And that was about a $500,000 purchase that I made.
Yeah, it's very interesting point to make. And I wanted to ask you, like, why did you decide to sell the real estate portfolio? Like, was there, you talk about passive income, like, if you see the discussions around real estate, I have a friend who sold a lot of homes and eventually is into Bitcoin. And he says, I never get called about a leaky faucet or a squatter or whatever, Bitcoin never calls me about that. So yeah, like what made it click for you to like move from real estate into Bitcoin? Like, was it like realizing that passive income isn't really passive at all? The mining is also not, setting up the mining per your example, is also not passive in that sense, but like what made that click for you?
2020 showed me that most people's properties were backed by debt, and you can go back to 2008 and see why this is the case. It didn't matter if you owned your house. I will not have real estate as my wealth building and wealth securing vehicle. It was just too much. This quote, passive income, and find that it's not so passive, even if you have a halfway decent manager. So, the extra time, the extra maintenance, the loss of faith in it being the right asset for the next 50 years.
Wow. That's awesome, man. Awesome. Well, that's really cool to see, to make the switch, right? Because conceptually, we talk about, Bitcoin will eventually demonetize everything that's overvalued, right? With real estate, I think, as the prime example. Then, that's Michael Saylor talk. He talks about the S&P 500 and all these companies. But I think that the store value kind of like moving from preferred real estate to preferred Bitcoin, I think will have a great impact on society in general, right? Like that if everything or like all the homes become cheaper to live in, I think we will solve a lot of problems. So I think it's really cool to have you as an example of someone who actually made that switch. So now you offer, I would define it as like hosted mining, right? I think that's the term for it. How can people that participate in your facilities generate this passive income? Like, is it really passive? Is it really like okay, I send you the money and you give me Bitcoin every month, or is there more to it?
Yeah, so you nailed it. If you want to simplify it to its bare bones, the reason that people invest in real estate is to get tax advantages because you can depreciate these assets over any time frame. And when you actually own your mining computer and it's managed by somebody else, it means that you're handing the money to manage an asset for you that produces Bitcoin, but that depreciates over a 3 to 5 year time frame. But the benefit really is hands off. You get as involved as you want to. You can do your setup call and send us money and just see Bitcoin come in and not really talk to us. Or you can participate in every one of our educational calls and come out for a site visit and do it like I did. So they can either go, retire to a beach somewhere or keep doing what they do best in their active business. That's the service that we offer.
Yeah. So how do you position it with regards to, if I'm into Bitcoin and I have cash, I can also buy Bitcoin versus buying a miner and getting this passive income. Like how do you approach talking about this?
So there's a couple different reasons why you would mine instead of buy. And I qualify this by saying you should buy Bitcoin, you should own Bitcoin, and you don't get into mining to stack miners, you get into mining to stack Bitcoin, right? Let's just set that as the ground level. The goal is not to end the game with the most miners, but with the most Bitcoin. So the reason that people would get into mining, one is it's a tax lever to pull. So if you just say you have taxable income this year and you go and buy Bitcoin, you still owe taxes on your income because you didn't offset it with any kind of physical equipment. Businesses with things like heavy equipment or prepaying for marketing expenses or buying a private jet, you'd appreciate, there's all these different vehicles, trucks, SUVs, Range Rovers, whatever it may be. They're all trying to offset the need to pay the government to get something that you can use in the business.
So how do you mitigate kind of like this hosted mining FUD? I mean, last cycle we had different companies. I think the main one that got attention and imploded was Compass Mining. And I think, mainly, and it's also my thought, so I'd love to hear how you approach that, conceptually, I'm all on board, but of course, it's hard to think about, okay, so I own a miner that is in some sort of facility, perhaps in another geographical location, another jurisdiction, etc. You do the maintenance, you make sure it's working, but what if it breaks or, I don't know, there's a flooding or there's a whatever, right?
If you've been in the mining space for any length of time, you've heard any number of horror stories. And there's a couple things to unpack with that. One of them is, many miners have gotten burned by seeking out the cheapest energy they could overseas somewhere, whether it be Russia or, Paraguay or Venezuela or Kazakhstan. Miners are naturally incentivized to find the cheapest energy, but sometimes the choice to take the cheapest energy at all costs is the most expensive decision that you can make. So that's one. And the way that we approach that is being in the US is one of the safest places historically that you could be. And specifically Oregon, we really like because it's got this extremely friendly climate. It's got really good precedent for data centers being here. And in general, your machines are going to last much longer than if they were in, say, Texas or somewhere that's very hot and humid. So that's one thing, is being in a good jurisdiction and being in a good environment. And then the second thing is, if you have a fire or flood or, tornado or something that destroys your facility, like earlier this year, there were quite a few hurricanes that spread through the southeast of the US, and a lot of facilities in Georgia were damaged. One way that we mitigate that, again, Oregon is really great because it's got this really low incidence of natural disasters, where it's this very even, cool climate throughout the year and not really prone to these kind of more terrible natural disasters that happen. And then the other thing is just insurance. I mean, in the case that everything goes wrong and your stuff gets destroyed, your host needs to be insured, which, we carry great insurance policies. And unfortunately, sometimes it's hard to get a strong insurance policy when you put your miners in questionable locations in the world. So anything that would be true of running a more traditional business, you also have to look forward to, or you have to look out for in the mining business. And unfortunately, throughout the history of hosted Bitcoin mining, there's been a lot of stories of people not running businesses in the way that you would expect someone to run this kind of operation that often is housing millions or tens of millions or even hundreds of millions of dollars worth of computing equipment. So basic standards around securing a business and securing property are extremely important. And I think we've done a great job mitigating those. We're in Oregon, so we have the mighty Columbia River hydropower network that goes through Oregon and Washington, as well as British Columbia up in Canada. So that is our main source of power, is hydroelectricity. And if you check out, for example, a video on our YouTube channel, you can actually see our site as well as the dam that's nearby that's supplying that electricity. And in terms of just, raw numbers for growth, we started out the year with just one site. We're now at 4 sites all across Oregon. We have about 25 clients in all of those sites, from a single unit to several hundred units, and excited to keep growing. I would expect that in a few months, we're probably at something like 10x our current capacity, just because we've been in the middle of a fundraise now for a while. And we really want to be the largest grid balancing resource in the Pacific Northwest to that mission of abundant energy and making the cost of living cheaper for everybody through energy innovation. If we can grow to the size that we want to, then we've got a real vehicle where we can have an impact on the lives of people, not just that are in our facilities and getting passive income through Bitcoin mining, but the local communities as well.
Yeah.
Quick question. If you have your Bitcoin in self-custody, where are you keeping your Bitcoin seed words? For me, there's only one way, and that's backing up my seed phrase with stamp seed. It's a single durable plate without any parts or materials. Stamp your words into solid titanium, which is fire-resistant, water-resistant, and built to last. Unlike etching or engraving, stamp seed's patented tools help you to deeply stamp every letter for permanent readability, making it easy for you to protect your generational wealth. Don't risk losing your seed phrase on paper. Get a stamp seed plate for unmatched protection. You can use code BRAM, that's BRAM, for 15% off at stampseed.com.
Yeah. I'm not really up to date about the Oregon, the Bitcoin friendliness in Oregon, but have you had interest or talks with local or state government yet?
So Oregon is a blue state. So it's not necessarily as easy of an environment like Texas or Oklahoma or some of these states that have passed right to mine bills. But the benefit that we have is we've got some very prominent and active Bitcoiners who live in Oregon, including Troy Cross and Dennis Porter. They're both based here. And so earlier this year, I'm not sure if this has been put forth yet. It might be about a month from now in the legislative session, but they are going to introduce some Bitcoin-friendly legislation that is a right to self-custody bill, right to run a node, and all of the things that we've come to expect from, enshrining the rights of Bitcoiners at the state level. And I'm really, really excited about what Dennis has done in several states across the U.S. and the way that that's been progressing, and excited to add Oregon to that list.
It's good you mentioned that. I think my least watched episode is the one with Dennis, whereas I think that should be one of the most watched episodes. Yeah. It's, when you think about policy, regulation, stuff like that, you think like, oh, that's boring. But I think actually Dennis has found a great, let's call it a strategy in order to, basically like create a blueprint, right? For states to enshrine these rights into state policy, which I think is a perfect, another like sly roundabout way to actually, really get these rights into law, which probably will open up, way more opportunities for you or anyone else who wants to do something with Bitcoin in the state that they live in. So, if you're listening to this podcast, go to my channel, look for Dennis Porter, and you will find that episode, because I think it's really, really great what he's doing.
It's a constant topic in the Bitcoin circle that, we don't need the state. We don't need the state for anything. This is an independent system. And I appreciate that perspective, but, and in line with what Jeff Booth talks about, there is no us versus them. Like, it's all us. We're all in this together in some sense. So everybody that you have no interest in cooperating with, or say, doing business with, or making these things happen, There's just other people that are waiting to be orange pilled, and their vehicle might be getting some of these bills passed into law such that they're forced to look at it. It's the same with getting pensions on board, getting other corporations on board. All of this is critical infrastructure for the next wave of people to be able to come on and feel safe.
Yeah, I agree 100%. I mean, whatever way, up, over, under, left, right, we have to get Bitcoin everywhere. And I think, why would you want to keep arguing with people that don't like it if you can also, I don't want to say subvert, but like make them adopt it through logic and reason, or, in terms of Wall Street, I'd say greed. But that only solidifies Bitcoin into the world, and then we get closer to that future that we all envision. So I agree with that 100%, that we don't need these people, I'd say, but I think it's beneficial for everyone when they are on board, whether they understand it or not, So yeah, I agree with that. But yeah, I'm excited to see that, like just general game theory of adoption, and it's something I wanted to talk about, but then more like about the game theory of mining, like currently we have about 5 countries known that are mining Bitcoin with government resources. I think it's Kenya, Bhutan, El Salvador, Ethiopia, and the other one I forgot. I think is that Qatar or Oman, where there's like a marathon? Oman. I think it's Oman. Yeah. And, it's so fascinating to think about, like, we are still so early, etc. I think we are still early, but I mean, there's countries mining Bitcoin with government resources. I mean, that's where we are after 15 years. And I really realized that actually when someone talked about that Middle East facility, like that's $1 billion facility. And then someone said, like, do you think that's an experiment? Like, if you invest $1 billion, like, what you're investing it to, right? So you should not approach this as an experiment. This has a business case, so they know what this is. They know why they want it. They know why they can do it, like all these things. And then I really realized, yeah, like, of course, like we are already there. And I think that will grow. But that is the question that I wanted to ask you. Like, what are your thoughts on the progress of this global game theory with regards to mining Bitcoin with government resources?
5 countries is still quite early, in my opinion. And I'll be the devil's advocate on this and say $1 billion, that's a lot of money, maybe to you and I, but for a sovereign wealth fund or a nation state, $1 billion is just a taste test that is, regularly wasted in a government budget on, an hourly basis, let's say, in the US. So it's a lot of money, but put it in this framing. Bitcoin now is a $2 trillion asset, and it's still 0.2% of all global assets. When Bitcoin was a $1 billion asset, it was huge in the sense of most companies never get to that size, but it was absolutely minuscule and could be really easily overlooked in the sea of investment vehicles that most people store their wealth in. So mining as the underpinning infrastructure for that, $1 billion sounds like a big investment, but if you put it in the context of the world's energy resources and the world's untapped energy resources, it's still just the very beginning of what we're going to see go into this space, in my opinion.
Yeah. Yeah, it's just, just such an interesting thought when you just think about, like, we have a seat in this stadium and we're going to watch this unfold, like, it's just so interesting to just follow in general. Like, we can conceptualize about the game theory and all the low-hanging fruit that we mentioned in the beginning. Like, yeah, it just makes so much rational sense to start doing this. But yeah, the information around this is not evenly distributed, right? So it goes in waves up and down, but I do think there will be some sort of inflection point. I like the analogy that Safety Namus has with, like, gunpowder, right? Like, you cannot ignore gunpowder. You cannot say, like, oh, my sticks and stones or my spears are better than your gun, right? And then poof, you're dead. Like that. I like thinking about these processes that have already happened in the past dozens of times. And this is just a different type of context. If this was a bad idea, a bad concept, if the concept of a decentralized, non-sovereign, global instant money is a bad idea, that it would have died 15 years ago. Do you know how many random ideas get, published on the internet every day? And we are at countries mining Bitcoin with government resources, so this is not a bad idea. Like, this has potential to exist for a very long time. And yeah, once you see that, it just becomes entertaining to see how this is all playing out.
Just for Bitcoin in general, the fact that we are entering a period where the most powerful country in the world has a supportive administration for this technology is something that we haven't had yet. And I don't think people have fully underwritten what that means. I mean, talks about a strategic Bitcoin reserve bill coming out within the next 90 days are just like, if you had talked about that 2 years ago, people would have called you crazy. And the fact that it's being drafted and likely going to come to a vote within the next few months is something that I don't think most people have priced in. And, just in terms of what we were talking about earlier, most of the capital in the world still has not fully understood the space and still has not entered in any kind of size. At 0.2% of global assets, if we think this is the most important asset in history, then there's a very, very long way to run in terms of people getting on board with this and the deepest pools of capital getting on board. And in the mining sense specifically, energy has decided the fate of nations and civilizations throughout history. And this is, like you said, this is gunpowder for the energy world. This is a puzzle piece and a technology and a step change innovation that I think completely changes the game in what is the underpinning resource of our civilization. So the fact that only 5 out of however many countries are in the world, 183 or 293, I can't remember, less than 10% of the countries in the world have caught on to the most important energy innovation of the last century shows you that this is like electricity in the late 1800s. People are still afraid of it. They don't understand it. They're worried that it's going to upend civilization and kill them. And the progression of that being integrated into society is going to be one of the most impressive things to, watch on the one hand. And in my case, I'm really excited to participate as directly as I can into it. There's not many people through history who get an opportunity to participate so directly in something that can be so impactful. So I'm personally just really grateful to live in this time and to have a set of skills that I think are applicable to bringing about a future that makes life better for everybody.
Yeah, I think this is also one of the things that makes it hard to realize that we are living through this time, right? It's so big, and it feels sometimes that all the big things, all the big shifts, right? Like all the big technological advancements are things of the past, but we are really living in a time where a lot of things are happening at the same time. And I feel like because understanding Bitcoin is such a ego journey in a sense, right? That is also something that challenges you, where you think like, did I really figure this out? Am I really living through this period in time? No, probably not. Like I should not pay attention, something like that. I think it plays part in that. But yeah, I love what you said. I also think this is the most important technological discovery of our lifetimes. And yeah, I mean, we should pay attention to it. So I think that's what we're doing. And I love that. And I see your enthusiasm. So I think that's great. I wanted to ask you 2 more questions, a small question, but also I think what could potentially be a big question, because one of the things that people talk about in the future, and I wonder what you think when that will be, like if the block reward, it gets cut in half, of course, every time gets smaller and smaller, where probably the competition will heat up more if Bitcoin becomes worth more. So I think there's an interesting dynamic there. Like, yeah, how will miners operate and make money when the block rewards keep getting smaller and smaller? Like, what has to happen for that business to stay sustainable, but also to keep the network secure?
Over the next 10 years, we're at 94.25% of all of the Bitcoin that will ever be mined has already been mined, right? And the next 5% will be over the next 10 years. and then it'll be 120 years for that last 1% to be mined. So if you're not paying attention to mining specifically in the next 10 years, I'm not going to say that it won't be viable, but this is kind of like do or die. This is really the opportunity of a lifetime to participate and focus and really buckle down and put energy and resources to being the best in the world at this if you can. So that's one thing I'll say, is that this is absolutely the time. The next 10 years is, laser focused. Don't think about anything else, and you'll probably not have to do anything else after that if you prefer not to. The second thing I'll say is, this was the intention of the network design all along, was that it wouldn't run on subsidies, that it would run on actual transaction fees and use of the network. So we've seen this happen in brief periods when people are using the network very actively, or they're putting on these things like ordinals or runes or these other types of data on the chain, where transaction fees become the majority of the revenue that miners are earning. And so the question really is just, when does that flip happen? Is it in the next year? Is it in the next 5 years, the next 10 years? You mentioned the block subsidies going down to the point where, by today's standards, it's not a lot of Bitcoin that miners are going to earn. And the number of miners on the network are absolutely going to be greater. So there has to be some mechanism, some way for miners to still be viable 140 years from now. And the answer to that is just more usage of the network. So if you, like me, think that this is the world's money, minimum, the base layer of the world's assets, then you expect more people to be using it and paying to use it. And that is the bet that we make as miners, looking out further than 10 years in the future, is that people are actually going to be using this network and paying for block space, and that in 1 to 10% of transactions, or 1 to 10% of mining revenue coming from transactions, that it'll be more like 50 or 80%. So that's the directional bet that you make, is that more people will use the network and pay for it.
Yeah. I think that's a good thing to emphasize, because in essence, Bitcoin, at least for the next 10, 15 years, I'd say, is still an experiment, because I personally do see some sort of failure opportunity there, right? Like, I think the next 10, 20 years, if the price goes to $1 million plus, then, fiat wise, you could still probably earn enough money, right? But yeah, we have to get to a point where all the blocks are full all the time, basically, right? With lots of more and more transactions for you to also earn more. And I think there's still a challenge there when we look at like how we approach Bitcoin now, which I agree with. It has to be a store of value. Like, I have to be able to save in it and be protected before I'm going to ask for it in return for a product or a service or whatever. But I do think we have to get to the medium of exchange part eventually, because even when layer twos will be built on top, where, for example, there will be quicker transactions, the settlement eventually will be maybe one big transaction from one party to another, kind of like how banks do it now.
Everybody's got different opinions on the kind of arbitrary data on top of financial data being transacted on chain. And it's my opinion that there will just be more of it, and that people will be putting different types of use cases on top, in addition to just moving money around. So historically, those have been what people have paid most to include in the blocks versus just standard financial transactions. And I would expect that we see more of that, not less of it, as time goes on. So personally, I think that there's more than enough opportunity for people to actually use the chain for all sorts of different purposes and pay to use it, and that miners are going to be well taken care of far into the future. But can't predict the future. So, got to take it day by day.
All right, man. Last question. And I ask everyone the same question, which is, what is a core belief that you will never let go?
Anytime that you find scarcity in your life, you might ask yourself, is this true, or is this just my pattern of thinking? And I've found it to be true in my own life that any really, truly wonderful thing that was unlocked for me was usually unlocked just by a shift in perception and realizing something that was already there, but that I was ignoring.
Awesome, man. Thanks so much for sharing, and thanks for this conversation. I really enjoyed it. And yeah, man, let's stay in touch.
I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, you can click here to find more just like it, and click here to find all Bitcoin for Millennials podcast episodes. Also, please like this video if you want to help shine a light on the message of Bitcoin, and subscribe to my channel to stay connected. I hope to see you for a next episode.